Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents A Suspicious Science, The Uses of Psychology, by Rami Gabriel, narrated by Shawn K. Jain. Preface. In psychology, our passionate attempts to understand the mind are framed through analogies and causality. The purpose of this book is to provide a systematic exploration of psychology as A, an empirical science, B, a language for normativity, pathology, and aspiration, C, a discursive set of therapeutic practices, D, a basis for psychopharmacology, and E, a platform for imaginative culture. My goal is to refine our understanding of the extent and limits of the field as a science, and therefore as a set of discourses about science, truth, biology, mind, and meaning. In addition to conceptual analysis, history and anthropology are employed toward articulating a more interdisciplinary, multi-level, global, humanistic form of psychology that may serve to orient the field. My method includes a critical assessment of the nature of explanations provided through psychology in the various stages of investigation, including discovery, practice, methodology, and presentation to the public. This makes for a tall order, and thus, in order to offer a coherent epistemic analysis, not every aspect of the field is investigated with the same attention or detail. I make clear, particular editorial decisions in this respect, and direct those most interested in examples to chapters 5 and 6. First, some words about terminology. Use refers to the ways in which psychology and its accumulated vocabulary is enlisted to solve and motivate our actions, activities, norms, epistemological bedrock, ethical approaches, and institutional domains. This approach draws from Wittgenstein's late formulation of language games, in which the meaning of a word is its use in the language and forms of life, section 43 and section 340. To understand a language means to be master of a technique, section 199. Therefore, the meaning of psychology lies in its uses, section 197. I focus on uses because I am particularly concerned with how epistemological and ontological distinctions from science and philosophy come to exist as practices. The subject of psychology, the mind, has taken on the metaphysical stature held by soul and self as a crucial stage for identity, aspiration, and discourse on value and meaning. In the modern era, the mind is conceived of as the seat of thought, of consciousness. Psychology is then the study and practices by which we conceive of subjectivity and the brain. This territory spans biology, as we have gained insight into the evolution and anatomy of the brain. Phenomenology, insofar as we have developed qualitative measures of introspection, and ethics as clinical psychology and neuropharmacology play a role in how individuals manage their being in society. And yet many psychologists, being as they are immersed in a particular set of practices, may balk at the breadth of uses that I am putting forward as of a piece. To them I say that rather than delimit the phenomena to the approach in which we were trained, we must follow how techniques and concepts are being used and implemented in the world. Proposing and testing theoretical models in the laboratory is only one aspect of how psychology proliferates in terminology and societal practices. The success reflected in the ubiquity of psychology should not stop us from critically engaging the lacuna sprinkled throughout the domain. Like its early 20th century founders William James and Wilhelm Wundt, we should remain open to its continuing development. Suspicious uses. Claims made by psychologists about the nature of the mind, from Freud to cognitive neuroscience, have generated several schools of skeptics. First, the ontologically suspicious are dubious that psychological terms refer to anything, natural or real, at all. This position has been espoused, for example, by philosophers such as Daniel Dennett, Patricia Churchland, and Paul Churchland. In accord with the work of Gilbert Ryle, 1949, Dennett successfully alerts us to the metaphysical canards inherited from Cartesianism. He directs us to be suspicious of mental content. Rather, we should focus on quantitative data generated through the study of dynamic brain activity. According to him, we are virtual machines that self-stimulate consciousness through cultural memes and language. While I agree with his critique of the Cartesian theater, I part ways with Dennett's later work, which follows up these insights into an arid landscape of computationalism and conceptual logical analysis. Rather, I take mental content seriously by implementing a neutral monist approach, in which consciousness has the functional purpose of interoceptive allostatic emotional sentience. Also in the ontologically suspicious wing, the Churchlands seek to replace the vagaries present in discourse about the mind, especially those terms codified in folk psychology, with specific neuroscientific components and their functional descriptions. Basically, psychology is too immature a science, and the terms it is currently using, such as will, remember, and self, do not mean what psychologists think they mean. In fact, we do not know what they refer to outside of our own discourse about them. Because of this inaccuracy, conceptual analysis is doomed. Instead, these skeptics recommend experimental, theoretical, and synthetic work as more productive. Indeed, analysis of the mind-brain, as in Robert Cummins' 1983, and more recently in the work of Carl Craver and William Bechtel, follows through on this ontological suspicion of the terminology inherited from pre-neuroscientific discourses. As will become evident, I have sympathies with this latter mechanistic approach, albeit as supplemented by an evolutionary framework which emphasizes the role of effect. On the other hand, epistemological suspicion, based on investigation of the historical record, is articulated in the work of a different breed of philosophers, exemplified by Michel Foucault. These thinkers, such as Bruno Latour, Roger Smith, Thomas Szasz, and Frantz Fanon, each in their own way conceive of psychology as enmeshed in a sociology of knowledge and power, and the development of modern institutions of state authority and control. Their critiques are largely based on historical evidence. For example, Foucault's work on the genesis of psychoanalysis as a medical science which strips the subject of power and knowledge in the work of Jean Charcot. While this approach is ultimately not where I land, it is clear that history clarifies the context of knowledge production in psychology, and that power in the form of institutions, gatekeeping, and intellectual lineage shapes the possibilities of exploration. This position is in line with the work of Hans Georg Gadamer, who orients us through a hermeneutics of meaning which questions the ultimate capacities of reason within their historical and technological/methodological limits. Similarly, Ludwig Wittgenstein, in Philosophical Investigations, locates our epistemic convolutions in misunderstandings endemic to how language obfuscates custom, rules, and other practices that come to constitute knowledge. To address these important epistemological suspicions, I draw from the writings of psychologists Kurt Danziger and Jerome Kagan, who expertly describe the role of context in the behavioral sciences. Good uses. Some psychologists are happy to ignore this lineage of critical inquiry as a non-scientific ambush by humanities scholars. My project, launched as it were from within the field of psychology, remains faithful to the hope of securing a systematic interdisciplinary multi-level project for understanding the mind while also taking into account humanistic critiques about the context of psychology as a science. Accordingly, in the final part of the book, I reflect specifically upon psychology's relation to the human sciences and the arts. My sympathies with these epistemological and ontological suspicions ultimately led to my adopted focus on the uses of psychology. Use refers to both explicit reference to mental concepts, including those couched in neuroscientific networks, as well as implicit cultural frames such as medical, juridical, and practical institutions which mediate knowledge about the mind. This includes therapeutic endeavors, medication, and popular notions of psychic well-being, which may be highly under-theorized, but that enact forms of power, authority, and aspiration. These uses demonstrate that our science of the mind is co-determined by cultural context, methodology, intellectual trends, and power as manifested in institutions, capital, and received wisdom. In addition to synthesizing internal debates in psychology and philosophy, with debates about its context as a set of practices, the other unique quality of this book is a formulation of the affective motivations of belief itself. My focus on emotions is meant to encapsulate this confluence of forces in the subject by excavating the functional nature of belief. Meaning is thus constructed for individuals through their practices and their allegiances. The purpose of this book is not to deny that psychologists have delivered knowledge and techniques that are useful. Indeed, an empirical approach to the mind based on evolution, philosophy of mind, and materialist techniques can deliver clarity. The field of affective neuroscience, for example in the work of Jaak Panksepp, Antonio Damasio, and Frans de Waal, has convincingly demonstrated that our motivations are mediated by subjective experience of the body. My own research as an empirical psychologist has been concerned with the nature of dialectical relations between allostatic motivation, direct perception, and culturally enriched representations. There are certainly questions for which an interdisciplinary psychology is more helpful than other social scientific or simply biological approaches. As I argue in the latter half of the book, developing a model of sensible affective forms of knowledge illuminates such phenomena as the emotional mind of non-linguistic animals and the nature of the imaginary orders that humans construct together. Discursive practices such as therapy, as well as psychopharmacology, are methods through which we clarify our emotions and thoughts by narrativizing them. Similarly, I will describe how the psychological phenomenon of memory is better understood by the concatenation of philosophy, phenomenology, anthropology, history, and neuroscience. My goal in developing a critical anthropology of the uses of psychology is to articulate an interdisciplinary multi-level psychology. The frame I employ of historicizing, that is, contextualizing, our current state of the art is concerned with the conditions of belief during modernity. The prevalence of doubt during our episteme is part of the reason why a book about the uses of psychology is more perspicacious than a book about any single form of psychological enterprise. Our uses of psychology reveal more about us than results compiled by any one subfield. I encapsulate this insight by adopting the terminology of mythology to portray the explanatory/worldview/truth-telling demands upon the systems of beliefs, rituals, and practices which constitute the uses of psychology. My wedge through this exploration is the insight that beliefs about the mind are mired in our affective need for control. I will be arguing that psychology is a tangle of belief, practice, and institutionalization that, by dint of its theoretical aegis, has come to serve as a privileged path to secure knowledge about who we are. Psychology is thus contemporary society's preeminent discourse about value, the self, and materialist ontology. Accordingly, it is a suspicious science which enacts our doubts, hopes, and beliefs. Introduction. It's the best possible time to be alive, when almost everything you thought you knew is wrong. Tom Stoppard, Arcadia, 1993, Scene 4. Psychology is the stage for our drama of self-knowledge. A confused field of inquiry in which neuroscientists and computer scientists keep company with chakra healers and hypnotists, psychology is the space in which we understand the mysteries of who we are. It is the science and set of practices to cure what, in a deep sense, ails us: a lack of control. For the ancient Greeks, the human mind was the subject of rational philosophy and the target of ritual and tragedy. The intervening centuries have been witness to the substitution of abundance for certitude, and have accreted a sediment composed of British empiricism, phrenology, romanticism, and New Age spiritualisms. Splintered between parlor games and ethical systems, science and medicine, the arts and the humanities, the study of the psyche continues to careen between objective rigor and wish fulfillment. Psychology is part of a rich set of local knowledge practices constituted of cultural symbols from which we draw to make meaning in our lives. At present, it exists within an epistemic niche dominated by scientific ways of knowing. Much of psychology draws from this source of certitude, and yet the confidence we place in the study of mind is misplaced. This is because much about who we are remains unknowable. This leads to a situation in which the knowledge that psychology provides tells us as much about our culture and emotions as it does about the mind itself. Often it reveals more about what we would prefer the answer to be, rather than what we can justifiably claim based on the available evidence. Accordingly, one major theme of this book is the effectively charged relation between doubt and explanation. I argue that the uses of psychology are knowledge practices wherein belief and emotional needs are interwoven to compose the mantle that constitutes our understanding of human nature itself. By describing the goals and methods of diverse forms of psychology, I seek to explain how the emotional need for belief is nested in a set of practices we call psychology. There are myriad ways in which knowledge about the mind is embedded in our cultural practices of explaining ourselves and others. Some are formalized into institutions, such as consultation of medical professionals and the pharmaceutical industry. Some are informal, such as the ways we speak about our motives, and the ways we try to understand ourselves and others by relying upon the explanatory power of mental concepts like forgetting, stress, trauma, and so on. There are also practices which lean on the diffusion of psychological concepts, such as reading about neurotransmitters on the internet or discourse about feelings and identity that take place on social media. While psychology has a substantial empirical wing, the way this information is disseminated, interpreted, and infused into other ways that we relate to each other and conceptualize ourselves is not strictly in line with the scientific worldview. Rather, it is continuous with prevailing cultural practices. That is why the explanations provided within the field carry implications for our fundamental understanding of what is knowable, and thus play a part in how we come to frame our values, institutions, and aspirations. The questions we ask about the mind are shaped by the boundaries of our metaphysical technology, namely of what we want to know and how we want it to be known. As a set of ideological frames, our metaphysical technology is perpetuated through cultural practices. To name a few, personality tests, Adderall, psychological thrillers, visual illusions, and PET scans. Belief and superstition are intertwined at the heart of our uses of psychology, which then serve as reflexive visions of human nature. Thus, a book about the uses of psychology must also interrogate the conditions of belief by taking into account how myth and ritual ground meaning in our lives. Above all, my focus is upon the ways in which psychology provides us a fundamental constellation for the application of ontological, epistemic, and ethical belief. In the conclusion of the book, I allude to the survival and syntheses of mythology and superstition in psychology. My formal purpose is an analysis of sources of knowledge and cultural practices of belief in the contemporary study of the mind. Briefly, psychology serves as a platform for the construction of meaning in our lives because it resides at the locus of what we take ourselves to be at the level of ontology and ethics. The interior crises of existence, the fear, apprehension, anxiety, excitement, effervescence, and addictions we live through, are made sense of through the apodictic stories of the mind sciences. By dint of psychology's position between naturalism and superstition, these stories explain where we came from, our origins, where we are going, and how we ought to comport ourselves. My thesis is that explanations are intrinsically embedded within the desires and beliefs from which they spring. Psychology enacts the knowledge practices of a materialist origin story in empirical psychology, and the cosmology of humanism and individualism in the liberal subjectivities of discursive psychology. I hope to illuminate our uses of psychology by aligning their cultural, emotional, and philosophical motivations. The explanations psychology provides concern what it means to be a human actor, and are thus inherently ethical and contextual. Accordingly, analyses presented in the first part of the book, which suggest lacunae in empirical psychology, motivate a proposal articulated in the second part of the book for an interdisciplinary multi-level psychology that can integrate contextual, historical, and methodological factors. Overview. A suspicious science is divided into two parts, with an intervening interlude. Part 1 describes the history and present practice of empirical psychology. I take stock of the extent and limits of the mind sciences. Chapter 1 features a description of the history and cultural context of the institutionalization of the field. This allows for an exploration of psychology's epistemological and sociological commitments relative to philosophy, religion, and the human and natural sciences. Chapter 2 explores the crucial explanatory role of analogical reasoning exemplified by metaphors of mind. I describe how contemporary psychology draws upon concepts from biology and engineering. A contrast between the discursive and descriptive functions of metaphor use serves as a deliberation upon the pragmatic consequences of analogical reasoning. In Chapter 3, the history of empirical psychology is taken up to the present through discussion of the development of neuroscience and statistics. I take the opportunity to review major critiques of the methodologies employed in empirical psychology vis-à-vis foundational issues in the philosophy of science. A polemical interlude follows in which I argue that since psychology resides between science and superstition, it has come to serve as a modern mythology. I develop the idea that belief is a commitment to a way of experiencing and navigating the human epistemic niche of cultural symbols. I argue that aspects of psychology can be conceived of as superstitious rituals, which draw their authority from the epistemic preeminence of science. During the modern era, belief can adhere to descriptive explanation, as it does in the empirical sciences, or it can take an ethical or discursive form as it does in religion, clinical, and popular psychology. I explore the uses of psychology within this epistemic landscape. In Part 2 of the book, I turn to more popular forms of psychology. The focus in Chapter 4 is on self-help literature and its reliance on magical thinking. Popular psychology is the spiritual self-medication of our times. As a wisdom tradition, it provides rituals to enact our beliefs and aspirations. The focus of Chapter 5 is upon discursive uses of psychology. I suggest individualism is the foundational myth of psychodynamic uses of psychology. Technologies of the mind evolve. In the early 20th century, clinical psychology conceived of people as discursive subjects to be treated in therapy through conversation. In Chapter 6, I discuss how the biomedical model has eclipsed the discursive model, thus giving rise to tension in the differing notions of the scope of agency. I contrast discursive and biomedical models through an interdisciplinary multi-level analysis of alcohol addiction. In Chapter 7, I explore the creative uses of psychology. In particular, how mimetic and transcendent forms of art allow for reflexive articulation of norms, values, and meaning. In the conclusion, I summarize my positive project of drawing together empirical, discursive, and reflexive uses of psychology, as well as my critical project of comparing psychology to superstition. 1. Empirical psychology. Mind in a lab. Psychology, merciful God, you still hold with that? It is but a poor bourgeois 19th century thing. This epoch is wretchedly sick of it. 'Twill soon be a red flag to it, and he who would disrupt life with psychology will simply earn a thwack on the head. We are entering an age, dear boy, that will not wish to be married to psychology. Thomas Mann, Dr. Faustus, 1947. Chapter 25. In this chapter, I describe the origins of psychology's predominant use as an empirical science to understand its epistemological position relative to philosophy, religion, and the human and natural sciences. This includes an evaluation of the early stages of the institutionalization of the field in the German, American, and Russian contexts in which they developed. This chapter prepares the way for a consideration of the pragmatic use of metaphors employed in empirical psychology, Chapter 2, and the current state of the field, Chapter 3. Introduction. From Myth to Math. One way to approach the hazy origins of the study of the mind is to survey mythical narratives from the ancient world, as narrative tales contain implicit claims about the mind. For instance, Gilgamesh's dream of a meteorite, the intransigent poses of Achilles and Agamemnon, pathos in the Oresteia of Aeschylus, fury and ecstasy in the Bacchae of Euripides, and the joys and sorrows playfully expressed in the Book of Odes. These compendiums of the human soul deserve more attention as part of the enterprise of psychology because they are in effect mimetic depictions of humans. Philology and linguistics similarly trace the mind in motion through describing the structure of our communication. By investigating the objects, abodes, and modes of living of our ancestors, paleoarchaeology is also a study of the mind. As we develop a holistic understanding of how our acts and how our bodies manifest the mind, the breadth of psychology grows immense, maybe fatally so. Explicit study of mind, or at least the deliberate reductionism that implies explicit study in empirical psychology, begins in earnest with medicine, philosophy, and religion. All three branches of philosophy, metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics, are essentially about the mind and the precise nature of its relation to sensation, truth, and reality. Empirical psychology fulfills some epistemic functions that were previously the province of philosophy by employing a materialist ontology enacted through an epistemological adherence to the scientific method, as adapted through positivism and pragmatism to deliver a model of the human as a sophisticated learning machine that is born with particular cognitive systems like language and sensation to interact with its environment. In this chapter, I describe how these epistemic commitments were developed between the mid-19th and the early 20th century. Religion and theology were similarly dominant before this period. They offered ritual practices to ground metaphysical frames. Belief in the empirical and therapeutic practices of psychology fulfills some functions that were previously the province of religion. Part of the story I unfold concerns the faith placed in the scientific apparatus during the modern era. The other part of the story is how psychology developed effectively satisfactory explanations and practices. One major aspect of the use of psychology as a science is that it relies on the reduction of mental phenomena to structures, functions, processes, and anatomical circuits. In 1931, Grace Adams intuited that positivist psychology is essentially pursuing Thomas Huxley's notion that we are nothing but conscious automata. In pursuing reductionism, psychology adopts a positivist trajectory, wresting the proverbial soul from above nature down to the rag and bone shop of the body as part of nature. As we well see, there are more and less graceful ways to implement this post-Darwinian mandate of incorporating the human mind into the natural and human sciences. In this chapter, we trace various positivist and pragmatist attempts to construct a behavioral science of the mind in the last 150 years. A particular history. Because its roots lie in disparate practices, presenting a history of psychology is no simple matter. Before the 1850s, study of the mind was natural philosophy of reality and nature. As a way to talk about the self and soul, it was religion. According to philosopher R.G. Collingwood, during the modern era, the field developed a strict methodological template that self-consciously modeled itself upon the physical sciences. This partisanship forced study of the mind into the dubious business of seeking presumably unchanging laws of mental life. The most important casualty of this redirection was a rejection of the use of historical methods to study the contingent conditions of human life and the organization of local knowledge practices. Accordingly, the larger question which I work into and around in this particular history concerns the epistemic limits that are a consequence of adopting scientific methods and neglecting historical and anthropological methods. The formal model of scientific explanation, the Hempelian model, consists of covering laws or a nomological deductive model, from which universal laws, i.e. explanans, explain particular events, i.e. explanandum. For example, long-term potentiation, the neural correlate of long-term memory, is said to be the nomological and causal process by which the brain registers and retains neural connections that contain the stuff of memory. Despite the success of such findings, a major issue with formal scientific
Sample complete. Ready to continue?